Hi, my name is Phil DeLuna and I'm running to be a member of Parliament in Toronto St. Paul's. Today I have a conversation with Laila Balkhi. She is a research analyst at the Global Institute of Water Security. Laila's parents are currently in Kabul, Afghanistan. All of us have watched in horror as the Taliban swept through and took over the country of Afghanistan. At the time of this recording, the news of twin blasts outside of the Kabul airport were just being reported, and we had not yet known the extent of the lives lost. I felt that this is an important conversation to have, especially at this time. Okay, so today we have a very special guest. I'm so thankful that she's here to have this conversation. It's a very serious one. As of the time of this recording, which is August 26th, we have heard reports out of Kabul conflict and of a bombing outside of the Kabul airport in Afghanistan, with the removal of US troops and the announcement of that, and the taking over of the country by the Taliban. I wanted to have this conversation to talk a little bit more about the human side of this and to hear about the emotions and the conversations that are happening around the country and around the world with people who are affected by this. So with that, I'd like to introduce Laila. And maybe, Laila, why don't you introduce yourself and your story and a little bit of the context of where you are in your life and how you're feeling right now.
Sure, Phil, thank you. And thank you for having me for this conversation. In a lot of ways, I feel an outsider, looking in, kind of like a lot of people are feeling, I think. There are a lot of people who have more knowledge of this topic and of the context compared to me too. But I think I still ended up, saying yes to having this conversation because it is a conversation I feel a lot of people are having a lot of hesitation having. Primarily because Afghanistan was kind of nowhere in the news for a very long time. People kind of forgot about it because there were, unfortunately, there were worse things happening in other parts of the world, unfortunately. Suddenly, it's everywhere and it's consistently there. Unfortunately, it's because of that urgency of the situation and just how quickly the crisis emerged and how quickly it kept getting worse. And still, we don't really know what's going to happen. It needed to be said that, yes, a lot of people are feeling like they're not sure what to do about this. They're feeling a lot of my friends, extended family, colleagues, they've been very supportive. They've messaged, they've called, and a lot of people are asking what they can do because they feel a little, they feel helpless. And I empathize with that too. So my name's Laila Balkhi, and I'm originally from Afghanistan. My parents, my father's from the Balkh region. That's where I get my last name. It means from Balkh. And my mom's from the Herat side, which is sort of the western end of Afghanistan. I personally grew up in Pakistan. I was born in '93, so right before the first time the Taliban took over. So my family fled the first time round, and we ended up in Pakistan. My parents decided to stay in Pakistan, essentially waiting for things to get better, to be able to go back and live there, and for my brother and I to go up there and have the life they wanted us to have. Like I said, when the first time the US-led intervention happened in 2001, we moved back in the hopes that we would establish a life there, start a life there, get educated there. And things didn't, I think, education-wise, think about a country having been in decades of war. Things don't quickly get stabilized. The schools weren't quite really established yet. There was a lot of question around how our education is going to be shaped there. And I personally, my brother and I, we were very, very passionate about education. We did well in schools. My parents really, really wanted to prioritize that. So yes, I ended up applying abroad, and financially as well, we had very limited means. So the only schools I could really, that I could really pursue an education from would be really rich schools that give a lot of scholarship. I was very, very lucky to find my way into University of Pennsylvania in the United States. I studied 4 years for my undergrad there, worked for a year afterwards there, and then found my way to University of Saskatchewan to kind of explore more sustainability management side of things. That's another passion of mine. And I'll explain why. So part of the reason I'm very, very passionate about sustainability is actually because of how I guess my background has shaped my identity. I think that immigrant identity, that idea of conflict, was very real for my brother and I growing up. And I think I had a very, very high distaste of just politics in general when I was very young, just because I think I associated that with all the negative things and all things, war related. And that's just how Afghan politics at that time was. There was no established government, no established anything, and it was all conflict. So I wanted to focus on something, one, that helps people in some way, two, that that the people can agree on and unite over. So areas like water security, energy security, I was very passionate about, because it seemed to be, I think my passion is always to be able to go work in those countries and conflict. And I think it's because my identity was shaped by that history of conflict. Even though I wasn't there, it had a very, very significant role in my sense of purpose, my values. I think one thing I will say though, I never thought that my family would live through to see that day again. And it's really, really, it's sort of a tragedy that my parents fled the first time, but now they're in Kabul. So they're living through this time round, through sort of a future that they really, really wanted to avoid the first time. And for them to essentially go back and for history to repeat itself I think that's sort of the tragedy of it. And I think that's true for a lot of Afghans who actually, I have extended families who lived through that one time. Now they're living through it for the second time. So I think that's the most tragic part of it for me to hear.
That was, I have goosebumps. Like, that was such an incredible story. I mean, like, what you've been, it really highlights for me how much the experiences in our youth shape us, and the amount of the motivation. And I really love the way you talked about how you wanted to focus on solving a problem that we could all agree on, and how you wanted to do something that made a positive influence on the world. I also, it struck me, as you said, the tragedy of your parents leaving the conflict the first time around. So for those who don't know, the Taliban rose to power in the 90s, and then there was an intervention. 1995, exactly. And then there was an intervention after 9/11. For a moment there, it seemed like there would be an opportunity for a democratic and revitalized Afghanistan. And then now, just most recently, all of that, I think the speed at which, over the past few weeks and months, the speed at which, once the Americans announced that they were leaving the country, the speed at which the Taliban were able to take over it has surprised everybody. And I actually didn't realize that your parents had moved back to Afghanistan. They're in Kabul right now. When did they move back?
They moved back, I think, a year and a half, 2 years back.
Wow.
Winter of 2000. It was right before COVID.
Wow.
I remember, yes, the COVID year kind of always messes up my timeline a little bit, but I think it was right before all of that happened.
Wow. And that's another thing that resonates with me. It's like the sacrifice that parents have for their children, right? Like, they knew that home for them was Afghanistan, but they wanted to secure, like you said, your future, your brother's future. And but despite all that, after they've secured it, they wanted to go back home despite the risk, despite the conflict, because home is home. And I think that's really touching. I think that's a story that a lot of people don't hear about. I want to ask you, what have the last few days been like? We spoke a little bit earlier about the uncertainty. Can you explain that a little bit more? And what have you been thinking and feeling over the last few days?
It's like two different worlds almost that you're constantly trying to keep up with, and the fact that there's an uncertainty associated with it. No one really knows what to expect. I think up until the point that the United States made the announcement to leave, there was the uncertainty of what that meant in terms of war, because people of Afghanistan have lived through open war multiple times, and it's usually been during these transitions of power, whoever that was. And that's been going on for more than 4 decades in Afghanistan. So people have they've repeatedly lived through the trauma of war. And so I think there was a lot of dread people felt over what's going to happen next. And I think one of the biggest things people were afraid of was open war, which was a it was a solid possibility. And so, I think in a lot of people, and I think I personally, because my parents are there, was very happy that it was avoided, and whatever that meant, right? Whether that meant government quickly surrendered or whatever. I'm happy that it avoided whatever happened, like whatever was, I'm just happy war was avoided. And that's because a lot of civilians get in the way of war. It's not just between governments, it's not just between militaries, especially I think now open war means air raids. That's one way that, that's one way of defense, and air raids really, really result in a lot of massive amount of casualties. So just as somebody who has parents there, who has some of the family there, was very, very afraid that open war would mean open air raids in some high risk areas, which tend to be government areas, and that's all over the city. My parents live very close to the, I think, Foreign Ministry of Affairs, close to the central city, which is the equivalent of downtown here. And so those kind of concerns are very, very real leading up to that. So the fact that was avoided was one, I think, I saw that as a very, as a huge positive. But that's still, there's still a lot of bad news that followed after the situation in the airport. I think the uncertainty around what's going to happen, the swiftness with which the Taliban took over, I think the trauma that people have experienced with their rule before, that's what makes them this terrified and this distrusting. I think it is still a country that's sort of put on hold. A lot of the government agencies are closed. A lot of the people who work in the government, who cooperated with, foreign agencies, for example, are all pretty much, trying to stay indoors, trying to stay quiet, trying to lay low. And there's nobody really knows what the next day will bring.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I one of the things that really resonates with me is you said there's a sense of relief that there was an actual open war. And I think that a lot of people are looking at this takeover of the Taliban, and of course they're scared about what's going to happen next. But I think you really put that perspective for me, in some ways, this is better than an alternative of a long drawn out battle where lots of civilian lives were lost. And as you said, many folks, generational trauma from successive wars in that country over and over and over again, that leads to suffering, and that leads to more radicalization, and that leads to more pain. The fact that for the most part that was avoided is a good thing. And I think that's really, really, really important to recognize. That being said, it's interesting now how the Taliban is trying to say that they've changed. And now the question is, how do they rule? An organization like the Taliban, a terrorist organization, deal with the business of governing and all of these services that need to be provided. And now they even have rivalries in themselves and other terrorist organizations like ISIS. And that complicates things now even further. So, and of course, the reports today of suicide bombs happening outside of the Kabul airport by IS trying to disrupt the evacuation to create more conflict for the Taliban. How can an organization like the Taliban govern? And what do you think is the expected outcome after the America leaves on August 31st?
And one more thing I'd actually like to say before I answer your question about what may happen, or what what the expected outcome is. But before that, one thing I would like to add to the perspective actually is there was a lot of confusion over the media, and I think this is part of the reason people are feeling so confused about what to think about this. Should the United States have stayed longer? Should we have fought them? Should we have left? Should we have left now? Should we have left 10 years back? Should have they been there in the first place? Like, why were they there in the first place? Like, there's all of these different questions being asked now, and it's sort of an analysis of history of what went wrong essentially. And I think the United States as well, I think this is a well-known fact now that they knew that it's, a failed mission a decade ago. It's just that it was such a popular idea to speak to the public about, an unpopular idea to speak to the public about, that most people just kind of avoided it. So I think listening to President Biden's first press conference about this, those parts of his speech, I really kind of understand that he says that, he didn't want to leave this responsibility on one more president. I think this did drag on for a long time, and the history of that failure goes on from, essentially very beginning of the early 2000s as well. And that's very complicated history. A friend of mine kind of asked, hey, I'm listening to all of these kind of different types of news and I don't know what to think. And what I worry about is that the voice of the Afghan people is not coming through.
Yeah.
And the voice of the Afghan people seems to be suppressed. And I kind of mentioned, I was like, interesting that you say it that way, because the voice of the Afghan people is not also one and the same.
Yeah.
It's a very heterogeneous country. And the history of it, it's very factionized as well because of this history of war and history of conflict. And so they don't really know what to think. I think a lot of the people, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there are opinions that also kind of have, because of that repeated trauma, are to the point where they just want peace. Like, we don't care who governs the country, we don't care what goes on, just leave us alone and give us in peace, let us live our lives in peace, and let there be calm.
So do you think the Taliban will give that peace though? Like, do you think that, I understand that it seems that there's an immense fatigue with war, and of course that's intergenerational, but if the Taliban, with the Taliban having taken over the country, will people be able to live their lives, or will they be suppressed in different ways?
There's just really nothing else to go by other than their word now, which does seem to be different. And the issue with that, though, is one, you don't have evidence to support that. There's sort of this branding that they're putting on top, but then when you I listened to some interviews or some transcriptions of the interviews even, and I kind of noticed as soon as journalists try to dig into what they mean by like, oh, we're going to do things, they're fine with them and doing, like, coming to work, going and getting their education, going to school, as long as they follow as long as it's under the Islamic Sharia law. And so people try to dig in, like, what do you mean by that? So that's what you said the last time. And that meant horrible things. So nobody really knows what they really mean by that. I think one thing that's interesting is that they do seem to be very conscious of their social media image. So they are publicly coming and making these announcements to kind of gain public trust, and they're trying to say we're different, we're not going to do those things. They're trying to kind of minimalize almost like what was done before. They don't know those were actions of a few. It's not that wasn't like those kind of killings or those kind of torture or whatever, that wasn't mandated by the Taliban or whatever. And if that happens, we'll bring those people to justice and stuff like that. So it is what it is. We are here, right? They have taken over. Kabul has fallen. So all I can do is hope that they mean what they say now. It's just that, yeah, you have nothing to go by. What I worry about quite a lot is the fact that because of the consistent news coverage, the entire world is looking at Afghanistan right now, looking at them and trying to see what they'll do. And I'm afraid that they're maintaining this image, which happens to be vague and which happens to be very carefully put together. It's sort of a front that it's there for people to kind of, start being distracted by other issues around the world, and for it to kind of go off media for a little bit. And then they'll start bringing in the specifics of what we mean by let's do everything by Islamic Sharia law, like their barbaric version of it. They're not a consistent form of government with, the way, like, we don't have established values and established, governance forms. And a lot of these people they're not, educated people. And I don't just mean like formalized education of degrees and diplomas. I just mean understanding of what it means to govern. those kind of things, that doesn't really exist. The only way they governed before is by this language of fear, and by, essentially those weapons they hold. And that's how they governed before. That's how they seem to be running things so far. So those are not good signs.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask one more question then, and then we'll end the conversation here. What do you think that Canadians can do, if anything, going forward to help, if there's anything that can be done? And I'll follow that up with another thing, which is, um, what's next for you in this? And is there a future one day where you hope to go back to Afghanistan?
So in terms of what can be done to help, I think you had asked this question as well about, which I really appreciate, is that what can I do to help the situation on the ground? And I unfortunately kind of struggle to answer that, because the on the ground situation, it is hard to help. But I think there are organizations that are involved at the level, at the federal level, where the efforts are taking place in terms of evacuation, in terms of resettlement here, that do have access to those platforms. So I think, and I Googled myself just to see what I can do from here, because I in a lot of ways felt helpless as well. But I think I try to look for these organizations, and there's a lot of lists of them. There's a couple articles that a lot of journalists have sort of put out there with a list of those organizations. It's very easy to Google and find them. They're doing, I think they're doing things in a couple of ways. One is to write letters to the MPs and write letters to their local political reps. And I think essentially to say that, hey, if the Talibs seem to be conscious of their, media image or whatever, and trying to build this new reputation, let's pressure them on that. The international community has been, I think, doing a good job of keeping that pressure ongoing. Is, okay, your Kabul fell, you took over, but now we don't want that rule that you brought the last time. We want women and girls to be able to have access to education, be able to work. We don't want, any compromise of human rights on the ground. And I think, I don't know if that's what's making them conscious of their media image, but let's hope it is. And so I think consistently maintaining that international pressure for the Talibs to maintain that, uphold some version of human rights, some version of women's rights. I think that's, hopefully that has an effect. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is donations. A lot of these nonprofits are collecting donations for, I think, families that are being evacuated and resettled here. And I think some are directly going to resettlement efforts. So there's different ways they're doing things. It's worth Googling. So that's one way to be able to help. The other way to help is, I think there was a lot of confusion. We talked about this before. There was a lot of confusion on the ground about all these announcements about evacuations. I think there were, big announcements made that there are going to be special visas, special immigration programs for Afghans at risk, for Canadians in the country, for Afghan Canadians who are there, things like that, and the equivalent of it from other countries that played a role, that had agencies in Afghanistan, for example. So one of the things that I think made things on the ground really complicated was a lot of these announcements were made, but they weren't communicated very well, in the sense that here's exactly how it's going to play out, and what does it mean if you're like a vulnerable Afghan, what should you do? Nobody really knew. So partly, I don't think that's the only reason, but part of the reason that there were thousands of Afghans or vulnerable journalists or even foreign nationals who kind of thought that, well, there's no other information, so maybe we should be at the airport. And there were people who were sort of, I think the first couple rounds of evacuation, I think that's what people witnessed, and they thought, oh, okay, that's sort of how it's working. We have to be at the airport. And so thousands flocked to the airport, and that's created a really complicated situation. And that creates ground for this morning's, over there, I think it was the evening, but terrorist attacks like that to be effective. So unfortunately, that's not a good thing. And it's just, I think everyone's really just having an intention to help, be able to really rescue people who are vulnerable. And so those kind of, I think, miscommunications or inconsistencies in communication has been really challenging. So if there's any way, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but if there's people who have access to some sort of channel where they can try to improve, or it's in their means to do so, I think what can be really, really helpful is to, come up with procedures or come up with a structure to communicate with people there about how these special immigration programs are going to actually be executed over time, and what that means for them in terms of what should they do now, today, tomorrow, or a week from now. So that's another one. I'm sorry, I have to ask your second question.
The second question was, do you ever see yourself returning to Afghanistan?
Well, so for the longest time, my undergrad, I think my undergrad applications up until coming to Canada as well, I think my entire education path has been shaped around, I want to really gain all the skill sets, all the knowledge, all the background that I can to be able to do something and I always say countries of conflict, because I think that the effect of conflict, the effect of ongoing war is very similar, and there's a lot of it in the Middle East, unfortunately. So for me, I've always that's where my sense of calling has been. Mm-hmm. So I think that's for the longest time, yes. But unfortunately, I think in the last, a lot of people are watching this in the news now, but for me and for a lot of Afghans who have family ties and who have families back home, situation hasn't been good for the last more than a decade, actually. So I think my family's always discouraged me to ever think of going back. So, so I don't know the answer. I hope that it's in the future, as dark as it seems now. I don't know how, but I hope things change to the point where I can go. Of course, I think that's, again, our identities are shaped by what's went on in Afghanistan, and that's always part of my identity. But again, I did grow up with an immigrant's identity, living in different places, getting an education in different places. All of those places have a sense of home for me. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I always say I have multiple homes now. But yeah, part of it is, I think some of it is Afghanistan. A huge one is Afghanistan, and just not the Afghanistan that we see now. But yes, in the long run, of course, I think I don't think there's any Afghan who would say, if the country's back to what it's supposed to be or what it was for their parents, that they wouldn't want to go back. Nobody leaves home like that. They don't leave everything behind because that was a choice. It's only because, that's the only choice is to leave. That's the only time when they take that choice.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for sharing that with me. And hopefully for the people who are watching this, they get a better appreciation and understanding of what conflict can happen and do. Maybe I'll just end this. Is there anything else that you'd like to say or touch on that we haven't covered already?
I think I'll just say, it's okay to feel like you don't know enough about the issue, but I actually think there's a lot of ways to find out more. And I think that's the best way to actually maybe even help if there's nothing else that you feel like is in your power. And I think a lot of people do feel helpless in the situation. They want to help, but they don't know how. They can't in some situations. But yeah, read about the issue a little bit, read about the history, read about the geopolitical complexity of it. I think that does a lot in terms of reducing confusion, and be open to have a conversation too. I think that's really, really helpful. If you have friends who are Afghans, Afghan Canadians, if you have connections back home, just give them the support that like just those words of supportive words and encouraging words, positive words. I think that's also really, really helpful. Send the positive vibes, prayers. I think that on its own is huge.
Great.
It's morale.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm sending my positive vibes to you right now. And I'm giving you all of my positive vibes and all my positivity. Thank you again so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. No, thanks for having this conversation. And I'm realizing we actually spoke for a while. So thank you for being open to a really long conversation.
Of course.